You know, John was not really great at transitions in his writing. He doesn't. Some of that just has to do with transitions are overrated. Okay. Another piece of it has to do with that's not that it didn't matter to him. He was after the message and not so much the style. And so when you're in First John chapter 3 and in verse 3, he writes, all who have this hope, and we've talked about the hope, all who have this hope in him purify themselves just as he is pure. And then verse 4, everyone who sins breaks the law. Well, that is actually connected to this idea of purifying ourselves so that we will be more and more like Jesus and his purity. But this is the other realistic side of that coin. You know, I talked about purity as a two-sided coin. You have number one, God's grace, which is the only thing that makes our purity possible, because the two primary lessons from the law are, number one, God has standards. Number two, you'll never get there. And then the other side of the coin is, you know, God's grace. Only his grace can get us there. Human effort won't. None of us have what it takes to effort our way to that kind of purity. And then the other side of the coin is, yeah, but what we have this privilege and responsibility to partner with God's grace at work to cause purity, to bring purity, the outcome being purity in our lives. And then John says, everyone who sins breaks the law. Well, I mean, that's also, you've got this, we have to have this desire, we have to have this goal, focus of purity in our lives. Well, you know, the other side of that is when we don't have that as our focus, then our focus is to gratify ourselves. And essentially what that comes down to is we'll sin. Everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. Okay. Sin is an idea that doesn't get a whole lot of airtime in our world today. It seems so harsh. It's antiquated. Sin, oh heavens, I am not of that group. I believe sin is our problem. And we can no longer afford to let it be the elephant in the room. You see, sin is what has led us way off track. Sin is the thing that has held us captive to a lifestyle that's futile, that's going nowhere and going there fast. Sin is what has put us where we are as a culture, as a people, as individuals. Sin is real. Now, is it fatal? Well, it can be, but does it always have to be? That's the hope of the gospel, folks, that sin is real. That not only is sin real, but you sin, and when you sin, you break the law, and everybody does that. All of us have this propensity, we have this proclivity, this drawing toward sin. And John says, sin is lawlessness. All right, let's think about that for a minute. The law expresses God's design, his perfect design. Now, we may look at it and go, oh, what's perfect about, certain animals that you must not eat or even touch? What's perfect about those dietary rules? What's perfect about the laws that, Well, and oh, by the way, all of these dietary laws died when Peter was on the rooftop at Simon the tanner's house in Joppa, and God sent down a sheet from heaven with with every kind of unclean animal on it, and said, kill and eat. All the dietary laws then went away. So what's the law now? Is the law those 360 different individual points of application that you can dig up from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? Well, that this is where it gets a little fuzzy. Just tell you that up front. But that was the law. God revealed his design. Now, others a lot more educated with better minds and backgrounds than I have explained that in terms of the laws of the Old Testament were, on a practical level, were to preserve Israel. Consider in a world where there was really only one way of preserving foods, and that was to salt them, that these kinds of animals, meats from these kinds of animals would have quickly spoiled and could have created disease and all sorts of bad things. That the injunctions to not marry outside of Israel was so that the genetic lineage could be preserved. There's an Old Testament scholar could probably give you 100 different reasons why the law was good and was helpful. But the problem with the law, that law was impossible to keep it. The most meticulous of adherents to that law couldn't keep it perfectly. The Pharisees in Jesus' day, their claim to fame was that they kept the law. That's where the Pharisee movement began. It was a call of reformation. It was a call back to the law of God, to God's design, to his ways, to his will. Over the 200 or 300 years between the time that the Pharisees began as a movement and the time of Jesus, it had become less and less about God's will and humble submission to his design, and more about proving one's rightness. Okay, sin is lawlessness. Lawlessness means you don't have regard for the law. And in this context, in specific, I'm making more of it than probably I need to, but I can't help it. No, let me back up. I could help it, but I'm not going to. In this context, lawlessness has to do with disregard for God's design. One of the things that I think should be empowering for believers today is that Jesus, in a way, he simplified the law. In another way, he embodied the law. When he said, here, all the law and the prophets hang on these two things: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he, on the last night of his earthly life, in the upper room with the disciples, he said, I'm giving you a new command, that you would love one another as I have loved you. This became the law for followers of Jesus. Sin is when we don't follow that law. Oh, brother. I am I am fatally flawed in that regard. I don't follow that law very well. Instead of love one another as he has loved me, I tend to fall into the pattern of trying to satisfy myself and make myself happy without looking too bad or doing too much damage to anybody else. It's kind of I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and around 68, 69, 70, there was this idea that, hey, if I'm not hurting anybody else, I can do what I'd like, which is really just a repackaging of all kinds of ancient bad thinking. Sin, John writes, is lawlessness. I've made more of it than probably is necessary, but hey, we need to define what sin is. Sin is when I break with God's design. And verse 5, but you know that he appeared, he being Jesus, so that he might take away our sins. And in him is no sin. There's the gospel. The gospel is we were hopelessly lost. Nothing we could do would save us. It was beyond our capability to save ourselves. And Jesus appeared so that he could take away our sins. And oh, by the way, the only way he could take away our sins was to be himself without sin. This is incredible. My personal belief about Jesus is that he was the smartest human to ever live. If today, if Jesus were to return in bodily form as he did in, AD 1, and if guys that do physics and physicists, and mathematicians and economists, if they were to ask him, how can we solve these dilemmas, he'd be able to tell them. Now, I know that's not in the Bible anywhere, but I extrapolate it from the fact that, he spoke the world and the universe and the cosmos into existence. They came into being by the power of his word. And that being the case, that demonstrates to me he knows everything there is to know. Anyway, whatever. You can believe whatever you want to about that. But I do know this. He never sinned. Ever. Not in intention, not in thought, not in behavior. He never sinned. And verse 6 says, no one who lives in him keeps on sinning. No one who continued to sin has either seen him or known him. Now, that seems pretty harsh, and on some levels it is. It's just a blunt truth. Here it is. No one who lives in him keeps on sinning. Does that mean that if I'm claiming to and endeavoring to live in him, sin goes away in my life? Look at what it says. It doesn't say they never sin again. It says that they don't keep on sinning. See, I look at that and I think, okay, when I came to Jesus, even as a little boy, whether I realized it or not, I was making a commitment so that I would not continue in a lifestyle of only trying to get what I want. Does that mean I would never do that again? No. What it means is it won't become the roadmap. It won't become the whole job description of my life. I'm going to fail. I'm going to falter. I will have times when I sin. But I won't continue in that sin. Does that make any sense? I've watched a lot of people move out of a life of absolute rebellion to God, others who stepped out of a life of futility, which was the result of rebellion toward God, but they didn't even know that's what it was. They moved into a life of walking in fellowship with Christ. They said yes to Jesus, and they learned how to give in to his design. Did they never sin again? No. But when they sinned, they interrupted the pattern of sin, this normal pattern of sin. And I think that's what John is saying. For those who live in him, they don't keep on sinning. They interrupt this pattern of sin, and not on their own, but through the power of grace. Well, the time went quick today. I've already blown past my limit, so I'm going to close. We'll come back to this idea next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.